Good evening. How are we all doing? Life is good. Life is good. It's all right for most people, it seems. Welcome. Welcome to the 61st Honors Colloquium entitled Democracy in Peril. Let's make sure it's there and it's still in peril. Yes, it is. Welcome. Before we begin tonight, I would like to share some housekeeping details. First of all, I am Carl Aspeland. I am the Associate Director of Honors and the person who doesn't know how to run a slide set. Housekeeping details. Exits are in the back and on the side should you need those. There are bathrooms in the foyer, and we would ask you tonight to not take photos or videos, please. I do have some QR codes for you in a moment, so hang on to your phones for a second, but once I'm done, please silence your cell phones and put away devices so that we can turn our full attention to our guest speaker, José Cheibub, who we are very privileged to have here with us this evening. Now, another note, if you do have to leave during the event, please proceed very quietly out there in the back. Sound travels very well from the back to the front here, and refrain from speaking until you're outside. Now, before we go any further, I would like to welcome Nitanis Baker to the stage. Nitanis is a student at URI and a Narragansett tribal member, and I would like them to join me for the land acknowledgement. Nitanis, please. The University of Rhode Island occupies the traditional stomping ground of the Narragansett Nation and the Niantic people. We honor and respect the enduring and continuing relationship between the Indigenous people and this land by teaching and learning more about their history and present-day communities, and by becoming stewards of the land that we too inhabit. Nitanis, please.
Hello, my name is Nitanis Baker. I am Narragansett Niantic and a member of the Narragansett Nation. The land that this school was built on is the unceded territory of the Narragansett people. We live throughout all of Rhode Island along with other nations such as the Niantic, Nipmuc, and Wampanoag. URI is a land-grant school. As is the case of many other land-grant schools, much of the funds used to build it were acquired through the selling of native lands across the country. Some of these include the lands of the Kaw Nation and what is now known as the Dakotas. We cannot let the public forget whose land they are on, how it was acquired, and the many tribal nations that were continuously dispossessed of their homelands and displaced in order to build these institutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Nitanis. Now, the mission of the URI Honors Colloquium is to foster campus-wide and community-wide discussion. In this spirit, we're thrilled to promote partner events with the Center for Humanities, whose sustaining Democracy Speaker Series is beginning this week. We are collaborating with the URI Theatre Department on a play that opens this week called Mackinac. There will be a discussion on Sunday after the matinee. We have an art showcase in Lippitt Hall, Democracy in Peril, the Politics of Personality. There are over 70 artworks in Lippitt. Go in there and take a look around the third and fourth floor. And then the Hera Gallery has an opening on the 12th that has as its background postcards that were being handed out. And if you didn't get one, you can get one on your way out. And you can fill in there what democracy means to you in 10 words or less. And they will include those in the show. They're literally papering the walls with these postcards. We also have conversations all around campus, and one of these is with the Rise Up Innovation and Entrepreneurship Challenge that this year is using the democracy theme as their prompt. There is a competition on innovating for democracy with cash prizes. And if you are interested in that, take a look at the table out in the foyer. You can meet Sharday Johnson and Cynthia Taylor there, who will give you more information. Or since you haven't put your phones away yet, you can use the QR code. One more thing, the Office for Advancement of Teaching and Learning is offering a workshop run by Dr. Nick Longo from Providence College, offering teachers a framework and practical strategies for embedding civic engagement across the curriculum. Another QR code for you to use there. And finally, I would like to thank the organizers of this colloquium. There's a lot of work that goes into this. 2 years ahead, they usually start. So I would like to thank our coordinators there from the Poli-Sci department and the College of Arts and Sciences. I would like to thank our sponsors, and I would like to give a special thanks to President Parlange, who is here in the front row, and his office, and our provost, Barbara Wolf, both of whom are sustaining sponsors of our URI Honors Colloquium. Can I have a round of applause for all of these fine people? And while you're all anxiously clutching your phones, here's another QR code for you. I would ask you to please consider supporting the honors program. We have so many activities beyond this colloquium that both community members and students attend for this, but you can support our students in all sorts of things by donating directly to the program through this QR code. Now, so once you've done that, you can put away your phones. Thank you. Now, before I leave the stage, I would like to ask you to join us in 2 weeks to hear Risa Brooks to speak to us on the role of militaries in democratic decline. And now, to present some exciting news about next week, and also to introduce our speaker, please welcome Ashley Rundlet, one of the organizers of the colloquium, and a professor of political science. Ashley, please. Thank you.
Don't put away your phones yet. I have one more. So we just want to remind you that next week we have a special colloquium event. Former Congressman Adam Kinzinger will be joining us. And this is free and open to the public. It will be taking place here at 5 p.m. However, it is a ticketed event. So while it is free and open to the public, we do encourage you to sign up as soon as possible. You can use this QR code, or there's also a link on the honors website. So far, the speakers in our series have offered different perspectives on the threats facing democracy at home and abroad. So last week, Andrew Thompson examined how racial demographic changes influence individuals, driving some towards anti-democratic attitudes and violent tendencies. Today, we're privileged to hear from José Cheibub, who will significantly broaden our scope. Rather than focusing on specific groups or attitudes, he'll take a structural view of democracy itself, exploring whether certain government designs are more susceptible to democratic erosion than others. We're especially excited about this talk because José will challenge a common argument, that parliamentary systems, like those systems that are common in Europe, are inherently better than presidential systems for sustaining democracy. Of course, understanding the comparative resilience of presidential democracies is particularly relevant to those of us living in the Western Hemisphere, as most of the presidential democracies in the world reside in our region. José Cheibub is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor of Political Science at the University of Pittsburgh. His influential book, Presidentialism, Parliamentarism, and Democracy, has shaped contemporary understanding of how these government structures impact democratic stability. Other closely related works include his book, Democracy and Development, which won the prestigious Woodrow Wilson Foundation Award. Dr. Cheibub's expertise is grounded in decades of research that has taken him around the world, consulting on the building of constitutions for countries like Kenya, Somalia, and South Sudan. He previously held positions at Yale, Texas A&M, and the University of Illinois, where he was my professor and also a member of my dissertation committee. I promised him that you would all not hold that against him. So please join me in welcoming Dr. José Cheibub.
Thank you, Ashley. Let's see. Hello. Okay. Just setting up the phone. Okay. Go. So hi, thank you very much for everybody for being here. Thank you, Ashley and Carl and everybody involved in organizing this event and inviting me to come speak here. I'm very honored, and I hope I do not bore you to death with this talk. So today, if we look at the news in the US and around the globe, what we see are phrases like democratic backsliding, democratic erosion, threats to democracy, and things like that. And in fact, it makes a lot of sense because we see leaders all over the world increasingly exploiting and nourishing polarization. Not only do they use it for their own purposes, but they incite it. And they do that pushing the norms of the norms of democracy to their very limit, often with the intention of perpetuating their power, their tenure in power. So the question is, what does this mean for the stability of democracy? What does having leaders doing that mean for the stability of democracy? One of the reasons this question is very important is because asking it was unthinkable about just a couple of decades ago. Nobody would ask whether democracy was about to survive in the United States or in the UK or in some other European countries. And it was just, everybody assigned a probability 1, which is no longer the case. For many people, the problem that we observe today, just like the problem that we observed in some areas of the world in the past, is the kind of constitution that the country has. In this case, it is a presidential constitution, such as the one that exists in the United States and has existed since 1783, when it was ratified. The reason for that, there are many reasons, and I'm going to talk some about them, but one of the reasons is that in a presidential system, power is concentrated in one single person who stays in office for a fixed term during the mandate of that person, regardless of the support that that person has in the population among voters, or regardless of the support that person has or that individual has in the Congress. That's one reason, the fixed term of the president. The other reason is that being concentrated in one single person, it means that that person holds a lot of power, and having a lot of power incites the desire to accumulate more power, and we observe a process of aggrandizement of the executive that's usually reflected in attempts to usurp powers from Congress and to rule by mandates, in this country, executive orders, in other countries, decrees, and so on. The evidence, when we think about it, it seems, at face value, seems very, very obvious and very strong that indeed it is presidentialism that causes, or at least is associated with, the instability of democracy. If we look at the cases, there is one country in the world that is a long-lasting democracy and that has a presidential constitution, and this is the United States. All other countries in the world, most of them located in Latin America, as Ashley said, in the Western Hemisphere, most of the countries that had also adopted presidential constitutions, they have suffered and experienced a very intense process of political instability and often the death of democracy. This is true for the Latin American countries, it's true for some of the African countries that adopted presidential constitutions, such as Kenya and Nigeria. It is true for the Asian countries that adopted such constitutions, like South Korea and the Philippines. If you look at the cases of parliamentarism, and they are mostly, or at least they were born in the western part of Europe and some central part of Europe, what we find is that most countries today that are rich and democratic with a long tradition of democracy, they have a parliamentary constitution. That includes the United Kingdom. I list them there. Norway, think of Western Europe, the monarchies of Europe that are democratic today, plus Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, all countries that are wealthy and parliamentary. And for many people, this means that this is sufficient evidence to tell them that we should adopt, if we should opt for a parliamentary constitution, because presidential constitutions have structural problems that tend to create instability. Plus, there is the added bonus that when we think about strongmen in this day and age, we think about Maduro in Venezuela, Ortega in Nicaragua, Duterte in the Philippines. They're all presidents. They are not prime ministers. So what I want to do here today is to doubt this evidence, which is this prima facie evidence. I believe, I mean, the first thing I want to remind you that is, I repeat almost every day, and I'm sure you heard that before, is that correlation is not causation. The fact that many presidential democracies have been unstable does not imply that the cause of that instability is the presidential constitution that organizes the politics of those countries. What I'll try to argue here is that presidents are not more likely to be backsliders than prime ministers, and that presidential democracies are not more likely than parliamentary democracies to backslide or to erode democracy. Now, just so that I know many of you are familiar with these systems, but just so that we can be in the same page, let me spend some time, well, actually I skipped a part of the slide, but let me spend some time talking about, sorry guys, but my slides are, okay. They're out of order, so I'll put them in order. Let me spend some time explaining the difference, the fundamental difference between these two types of systems. Many of us think that the difference is that in one case you have a president as the leader, in the other case you have a prime minister. Most of the time this is true, but that's not the fundamental distinction between these constitutions. That's not what make them different. The difference comes from the fact that in one system, in the presidential system, the government and the legislature, the president and the Congress, they come to power and they stay in power completely independently from one another. When we vote in elections for president or in elections for Congress, they may be happening at the same day, at the same time we go to the same booth and mark all the things that we need to mark, but those are completely independent elections. The president is elected for a term, and that term is fixed. The Congress is elected for a term, and that term is fixed, and once they are in power, there is nothing that one can do to the other to change their policies. There is the issue of impeachment about which I'm going to say something, but that's not what I mean here. So in presidential systems, we have a fixed term in office. Presidents will be presidents until the very last day of their term. That feature is said to provide no incentives to deprive the president and the members of Congress to have any incentive to cooperate with one another. They don't need each other to stay in power. They are there for the duration of their mandate. So that, for many people, implies rigidity. And that may imply deadlock between the executive power and the legislative power, a kind of legislative paralysis that is a recipe for a crisis. And in the face of this legislative paralysis, one or both actors and some external actors will try to intervene in the process to resolve that legislative deadlock. That was the argument that was made early on about the instability of democracy in Latin America, and the argument is that while they were all presidential and they were all rigid, and when they faced crisis, the military, each actor would try, beg the military to intervene so that they could resolve their differences. The military would intervene and pass the power back on to the civilians, and like that they went. And so that's the structure of presidential democracies. Parliamentary democracies, on the other hand, they are defined by the lack of that independence between the executive and the legislative powers. As a matter of fact, the government in a parliamentary democracy exists only as long as it is supported implicitly or explicitly by a legislative majority. And we know it works like this. Voters vote for members of parliament. Then after the election, there is a distribution of seats. Party A got so many seats, Party B got so many seats, and so on and so forth. And these parties come together to form a coalition that will support a government that will then be led normally or usually by a prime minister. So that feature of parliamentarism, the fact that the government emerges from within the legislature, is said to provide incentives for cooperation, in part because the parties have to come together to support that government in power, especially since that government can be removed from power by a vote of no confidence from Parliament. So Parliament can decide that the policies that the current government is implementing are not good policies, and therefore they pass a motion of no confidence in the government, and as a result, the government has to resign. So that is the kind of flexibility that exists in parliamentary system that does not exist in presidential system. So that the deadlocks that may emerge in these systems are said to be resolved through the vote of no confidence. The consequence of this is that in presidential democracies, what we see is, presidential democracies are brittle. They can survive, they cannot face crises, because when these crises emerge, they die. Parliamentary systems can face crises because the majority in parliament is going to remove the prime minister and the government from office, and then then things are going to be good. I want to speed up a little bit because I'm taking a little bit too long. So let me reorder. I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about some nuances between these two systems, but very fast. One is that the vote of no confidence is not like impeachment in any way. Impeachment is a process to remove a head of government or somebody from government for some kind of criminal behavior. So it's under bad behavior. The vote of no confidence happens and is expected to happen under perfectly good behavior by the government. It's just it happens because of policy differences, not because of some kind of behavior that has to be proven in a criminal court. Parliaments in parliamentarism, they do not always have fixed terms. They have, because these are democracies, they have to have repeated elections. So in the UK, in the United Kingdom, then elections must happen at least every 5 years. But the parliament can be dissolved before those 5 years are completed, because say a situation like this, if the parliament passes a vote of no confidence on the government has to resign, the government resigns, the current parliament is unable to find an alternative government, and therefore the head of state dissolves the parliament to try to give voters the chance to return a different distribution of seats and then form the government. So that's one important nuance. In presidentialism, remember, everything is fixed. We know today when the 10th election from now is going to be held. And finally, in terms of nuances, in presidential systems, heads of states are the heads of government, and those are the presidents. In parliamentary systems, the head of government, the person who leads the set of people, the ministers, who are going to make policies, decisions for domestic policies, it's the prime minister. But the head of state varies. In many countries, it is a monarch who plays absolutely no role, like in England, in Norway, in Sweden, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark. In other countries, it is an indirectly elected president, like in Germany, in Italy, in Greece. And in other countries, it is a directly elected president, like in France. We saw in the summer the election that led to almost election of Marine Le Pen, and in Portugal, and so on. So the head of state in parliamentary democracies and the head of government are separate. Now let me organize myself here. So the consequences that I meant, the brittleness of the Constitution and so on, the question is that people then say, well, this is what these constitutions will produce. They will produce that kind of brittleness. They are structural, and my argument is that that's not the case. So there are several ways I want to argue this here with you. The first one, I'm just going to say it because I won't have the time to show you, but in some previous work I've done, I showed that the incentives for coalition formation that people say do not exist in presidentialism because of the fixed term in office, in fact exist if we make an assumption that people make about parliamentary systems. So this is how it goes. For people to decide that the fixed term in office of presidential democracies will lead to this deadlock or to the legislative paralysis, what they must be assuming is that all that presidents care about is to stay in office, and all that legislators care about is to stay in office for the duration of their terms, even if they don't do anything. Even if they cannot agree on anything, they cannot pass any policy. In every presidential constitution, this country is included, you need to have the assent of the Congress and the assent of the president for policies to be enacted, to become law. Therefore, they must cooperate. If they do not care about policies, then they're not going to cooperate. But if they care about policies, an assumption that is explicitly made about prime ministers, but for some reason not about presidents, then they will have to cooperate because they cannot act alone, and they cannot or they do not want to stay in office without doing anything. So this idea that the incentives for cooperation do not exist in presidential systems is not a very good idea. And I did some research about this, and I showed, for example, so I did, in one of the books that I worked on, I studied all presidential democracies since 1946, and I counted how many of them, and parliamentary democracies, and I counted how many of them were coalition governments, in other words, governments that were composed by the party of the president and at least one other party different from the party of the president, and how many were single-party governments, in other words, governments that were only, in the case of presidential systems, only composed by the party of the president. In parliamentary system, a single-party government would be, an example would be what exists today in the UK. The Labour Party won the election by a vast majority of seats. They alone formed the government, and all the ministers in the UK are now members of the Labour Party. But in the Netherlands, they have a coalition government in which the prime minister comes from one party, and 2 or 3 other parties join forces with that party to provide support for the government in parliament and to prevent the opposition from passing a vote of no confidence on the government. What we find is that there is indeed a difference between parliamentary and presidential systems. So here I'm counting only the situations in which no party has a majority of seats in parliament. So the UK would not be counted here. I want a situation in which parties, in order to obtain a majority, they have to collaborate with one another. And what we find is that whereas 3/4 of parliamentary democracies do have coalition governments, when there is a minority situation, when no party has more than 50% of the seats, about 2/3 of presidential democracies have coalition governments. This effect, or this pattern, reproduces if the parliament gets more fragmented. So here are the parliaments in which no party controls more than 50% or more than 30, and less than 33%. So they are in that middle range. And here are the cases in which the parliament is very fragmented. No party is larger than a third, controls more than 1/3 of the seats in parliament. And what we find there is that the effects, the incentives for coalition formation are very strong, particularly when we find a lot of fragmentation. Almost all governments in parliamentary systems are coalition, and over 80%, over 4/5 presidential systems are parliamentary, are coalition governments. And I'm not going to spend time here, but this is just to say that, and these coalitions get to be majority in the sense that together they control 50% of the seats, both in parliamentary and in presidential systems, even though a little less in presidential systems, but which is important because it shows that they are able to pass the legislation that they have an interest in passing in collaboration with one another. So the idea that it's a matter of incentives, I don't think has a lot of support. Another argument that people make is that parliamentary democracies do not always, I meant to write presidential democracies. Well, actually, let me rephrase it. What I want to say is this, contrary to what people say, that parliamentary democracies are always better at surviving crises. They are not. There are many crises that they die, and here I'm going to show you a picture that I hope I don't lose you because of that. It's simple, looks complicated, but there are 3 lines in this picture. The black line represents the number of countries. This is a picture about parliamentary systems, not necessarily democracies, so the picture is mislabeled, in Europe. 34 European countries since 1800. So the first line, the black line, tells us the number of countries that existed. In the 19th century, as we know, there aren't many countries. You know, Italy was being formed as a country in 1870, Germany in 1870, Belgium became independent from the Netherlands in 1831, so nation states were being formed, and that's what we see there, a growth of the number of countries. The red line is the number of countries that have competitive legislators. Legislators that are produced as a result of an election in which at least 2 political parties are competing. And the blue line is the line that represents the number of parliamentary systems. Now, if you look at the 4th chunk of the table, here I divided the figure into 4 periods since 1800, and the last period, beginning in 1990, I lost the little pointer, but the last period is the post-Cold War period. And we see that in Europe, all 3 lines coincide. All countries are pretty much formed in Europe. There may be some marginal changes. They have competitive legislators, and they are all parliamentary. The argument I want to make is that we, as analysts, tend to see this situation and look back in the past and project that stability that exists today to the entire history of parliamentary systems. However, this is not the case. If we look first at the 19th century up to the end of the First World War, what we find is that this gap here is represented by the fact that many of these countries, even though they had a competitive parliament, the executive was controlled by an hereditary monarch. So those are not democracies. Those are not parliamentary systems because the government in these systems, they depend on the monarch and not on the majority in parliament. They need to have the confidence of the king or the queen and not of the majority in parliament. So this is a period in which we can't really say that there was parliamentarism. Then there is the interwar period, about which I don't need to say much, very infamous for all the breakdowns of democratic parliamentary systems, that many of them emerged after the First World War, like Germany, Austria, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Spain, and Portugal, and then by the end of that period, by the end of the Second World War, they are gone. They had become autocracies, dictatorships. So parliamentary systems in this period were very problematic. Then you have the period of the Cold War, and as we know, many countries in Europe were governed by communist regimes that were autocratic, And so there were the countries that had restored parliamentary constitutions, but there was still a gap between the countries that had a ruler who was not elected and a parliamentary system. So the point here is just to show that the history, the rosy history of parliamentary democracies is not that rosy. You know, has some different colors. And I better go fast. So close your eyes. I'm going to skip a picture. Close your eyes. Nobody saw that picture because we don't have time for that. So the question now that I want to address directly is, are presidents backsliders? Now, it's difficult to answer this question in a systematic way. Asystematically, you know, do a Google Scholar search, and then you're going to find what the community of scholars think about that. Well, when you search prime ministers and backsliding, you get 3,000 hits. When you search presidents and backsliding, you get 25,000 hits. People are way more concerned about presidents than they are about prime ministers. However, for every president who may have backslid, you have a prime minister. So for every Bolsonaro in Brazil, you have a Netanyahu in Israel. For Milei in Argentina, you have Viktor Orbán in Hungary. For Trump in the US, you have Modi in India. For Duterte in the Philippines, you have Thaksin in Thailand. So that's just, you know, illustrative, but it goes to show you that even though we don't think of, you know, prime ministers as being backsliders, there are many of them who do. So I want to see if there are some systematic data that allows us to look into that. Now, it's, as I said, it's difficult. Nobody knows, nobody agrees what constitutes backsliding, and often, as a way to avoid disagreement, people put in the definition everything that they think might remotely cause some kind of damage to democracy, includes some policies that we may dislike that have nothing to do with institutions or things like that. But there are some data sets that are being produced. So this one, for example, the Democratic Erosion Event data set that's produced by a consortium of universities, they have been collecting events of backsliding. They don't decide which country is backsliding. They just count. For many countries, they go there and they say, oh, the president did this, that's an event. Prime minister did that, that's an event. So I decided to look at their data, and they have data for 94 countries, 44% of which, 94 countries with backsliding events, okay? Of these 94, 44% were presidential, 56% were parliamentary. Of the parliamentary, remember I said that heads of state vary in parliamentary systems, 57% were parliamentary systems with a directly elected president, which some people believe is a problem, and then 43% with monarchs and indirectly elected presidents. So the data are not really that strong to tell us that one system or the other is worse for accumulating events of backsliding. If we look at the number of events, what we find is more or less the same thing. As a matter of fact, presidential constitution, countries with presidential constitutions have a slightly lower proportion of events, but they have more events per country. So the things even out, and the point is that in the end, you don't really have a lot of difference between them. Then you say, okay, so let's look at populist leaders. These leaders, they're not, always backsliders, but lots of backsliders are populists. So let's count them. Again, don't try to count it because nobody knows exactly what's a populist leader. A lot of people use it, in a way that's kind of almost political, but here we want to try to do it more systematically. So I looked at some data sets, one from Harvard, the other one from Stanford, and what we find is that the patterns are the same. The proportion of populist leaders that emerged in presidential and parliamentary democracies is about the same. Last thing, the new Latin American instability. Many of you heard about how many Latin American countries are suffering, presidents are being impeached. This is the list of presidents in Latin America who were impeached since 1991, okay? And the idea is that, I like this picture. The idea is that these impeachment events, they are just a new form for the permanent and perpetual instability that characterizes Latin America since independence. But let's look at the Cold War period and the post-Cold War period. So the sea of instability is the same. However, before the end of the Cold War, military coups were the mechanism that were utilized to resolve the conflicts between the executive and the legislative. In the post-Cold War period, it was what they call interrupted presidencies. In other words, impeachments or threats of impeachment, and presidents who resigned because they expected to be impeached. I disagree completely with this perspective, because to say that this kind of instability is just the same as that, even though the form is completely different, but they are just the result of the conflict between these two powers, is a big mistake. This is just to show that impeachments were happening. And the reason it is a big mistake is because when a military coup happens, nobody knows what's going to happen the next day. The military rolls out the tanks, they suspend the constitution, they close Congress, they kill the president, they torture the citizens, and then, who knows what's going to happen. When an impeachment happens, we know exactly what is going to happen. First of all, the president may or may not be removed from office. And whether the president is removed from office, we know who is going to take power after the president, and that's going to be the vice president, or the next person in the line of succession, the Speaker of the House, the head of the Supreme Court, and so on. So that impeachment doesn't break the Constitution, doesn't end the electoral calendar, doesn't suspend the electoral calendar. And I would say that rather than indicating the same level of instability that always happened in Latin America, it actually represents movement towards stability of the political systems in these countries. So just to conclude, I'm not going to summarize because you just heard everything I said. I want to just leave you with what I consider to be a little bit of a paradox about democracy that comes from this question. Are there specific institutions that make democracies in general more likely to be effective, to survive and to produce outcomes that are liked by most? And I'm thinking of the forms of government, just, should we have a constitution, a presidential constitution, or parliamentary constitutions? Many people believe today that the US should switch to a parliamentary constitution. Many people believed in the 1990s that most Latin American countries should do the same. But that could also work for electoral systems, for the judicial institutions, and so on. But the question is, do democracies function better under a specific kind of broad constitutional framework? So my argument is that democracies can function relatively well under many types of institutions, and that there is no one that is going to be better. Because what matters is the nature of the conflict that underlies a democracy. And there are many instances in which there may be conflicts that no institution can process, and they will be processed outside of the institutions. So think about this, and that's one of the last things I'm going to say. Democracy is a method for peacefully choosing who is going to be the ruler for a certain period of time. Or if you want to think about it, for alternating, for deciding to remove a ruler in a peaceful way, right? It happens through competitive elections. Two parties compete, they present their appeals, whatever. Voters choose, there is freedom of press, freedom of discussion, and so on. The voters choose, and the parties compete for access to power, and one of them gains access to power and is the winner. And that party, or that individual, has the right to govern for a certain period of time. The losers, they have to wait. And they have to wait for the next time an election is going to happen. If they don't, and this is fundamental, it's very simple, but if the losers do not wait, then there cannot be democracy. However, waiting becomes harder when the stakes that are involved in elections are very high. So when, for example, the country has relatively low levels of wealth, a lot of poverty, when there are short-term economic constraints, economic changes such as the ones brought about by globalization that affected workers and citizens all over the world, by transformations such as this from globalization, by polarization. So those are conflicts that are to be solved by the results of the election, because parties will change, will have different preferences. And under these conditions, when the conflicts are really intense, then it becomes really hard to wait, because you have a lot to lose by waiting. So what I call the paradox is something like, democracy is an interesting and very useful method for peacefully changing the regime or the leaders. However, it works best when conflicts are relatively mild. In other words, it works best when we least need it. When we need it because the conflicts are really intense and we're close to fighting, it doesn't work well, but that's when we need it the most. So that's a problem with democracy, and I don't think there is any institutional framework that can solve that dilemma. So, thank you.
We're now going to open it up to audience questions. We request that if you do have a question, that you please stand up. We have Beth and Brian going around with the microphones, and we also request that you keep it to questions and not statements. Thank you.
Hi, it's great to meet you tonight, by the way. So the main question I have is that regarding presidential versus parliamentary democracies, which system do you believe produces greater political instability versus, say, governing instability, where the physical institutions break down? Because if we look at electoral history in countries like Italy, which have a parliamentary democracy, the political instability of such nations is often higher than in nations in the United States. For example, the frequency of elections in Italy over the last several decades, the average time for a turnover of a new government has been only 13 months. So what do you think about the differences between political instability versus the institutional instability that you've described?
Yeah. Thank you. That's a great question, and I think my answer is, I don't think there is one that's better than the other. Because, I mean, we're interested in the average of these things, right? I mean, we can always say Italy was like that, and the US was like that, although, you know, political, it depends on all, I mean, so, it depends a lot on what we mean by political instability. I mean, I understand what you mean by governing instability, you know, it's whether the regime stays in place, whether the constitution stays in place. But political instability can mean so many things, right? And Italy is not even the worst case of parliamentarism. So think of France during the Fourth Republic from 1946 to 1958, 12 years in which they had about 20 governments. So it was a crazy period. But political instability can also mean protests on the street can also mean, can mean so many other things. So I don't think, at least I don't have a prior that would make me look at the reality of these countries and expect that on average, I would observe one of them having more of that instability than the other.
I'm going to use my prerogative to ask a question. Over here.
Oh, hi.
In terms of the paradox of democracy on the last slide, I'm wondering if conflict is sort of the problem, the intensity of conflict, does that mean that to look for solutions for democratic backsliding, we need to look outside of our political systems?
No. I mean, I think we first have to agree with what we mean by backsliding. I mean, I'm not saying that there aren't threats to democracy all over, but I think I have a little bit of a different outlook from a lot of people who came here tonight, or people who are, coming to talk. I mean, I don't know what they said, but I mean, my point is, I do believe that there is. I do believe that there are lots of people who are trying to undermine the norms and the institutions of democracy. But I also believe that this is more or less a constant in the history of democracy. We talked about that early in the class today, how we are so close to the events today that we know about everything that's happening in almost every country. But if you look at countries 50 years ago, 70 years ago, we didn't. And so we kind of gloss over. But if we had the same information that we have today about the countries, you will see that governments were doing as bad a thing as governments are doing today. People freak out about the National Front in France, but they were the Pujadists in the 40s and 50s, who were as extremist as the National Front is. So my point is that, no, I don't think we should look outside of the institutions, and neither am I saying that we should not think about improving the institutions. There is always room for improving the institutions. But my point is that we have to accept that we have to look for solutions to these conflicts. We have to look at policies that will address the causes of these conflicts and try to remedy them. Now, it is very difficult, of course. That's why I'm a political scientist and not a politician. I study them, I don't practice it. So, but, yeah, I think anyway. I'm sorry? Can you go back to the slides with all the percentages, please? Yes. With the percentages, you said? Yeah. Okay. This? Yeah, that one. Okay, all right.
With the state our country's in at the moment, especially with this upcoming...
I'm sorry, start again.
With the state our country's in at the moment, especially with this upcoming election, do you think the issues that we have are residing more in the political instabilities or the more institutional ones?
More structural ones, you said? Institutional ones.
Yeah.
I don't think the issue is institutional. I mean, I believe that there is an institutional issue in the United States in general, which is the issue that there is a constitution that cannot be changed, even though everybody believes that it should be changed. By everybody, I mean a lot of people. I wrote recently a paper examining all the presidential elections in the world. In the beginning, in the 1800s, when Latin America and the US were the only areas of the world with presidential constitutions, many of them, not all of them, adopted a system of electoral colleges, just like in the US, or similar to the US. By 1870s, they started to abandon them, and by 1900, all countries except Argentina had abandoned the electoral college because I read some of the constitutional debates. They were referring to the United States, how badly and how captured by the parties the electoral college could be, and so on and so forth. So my point is not, I don't want to, well, excuse me, but I will criticize. I don't think it is a good system. But the point is, that is the institutional problem. But the election itself, I think it is a political problem. There is no institutional problem with respect to the election. I mean, we have an electoral system that works the way it does. Everybody who went into this election to be candidates, they know exactly how the rules work, and they do exactly what they have to do to win. For the first time, I'm living, at least consciously, in a state that is a swing state. And to my surprise, I'm seeing lots of ads for both candidates for president, which I had never seen before because I lived in states that were either one side or the other. So I don't think that's an issue. It's a political problem. There are lots of grievances all over, and I think both, and those grievances are not easy to be dealt with, and I think they're trying to find solutions for them. But so anyway, institutionally, I don't think that that's the problem. I think.
We have time for about 2 more questions.
Hi, thank you. So when we're looking at the Congress, and I think this is related to the last question, when we're looking at congressional dysfunction, gridlock, and the last since Obama's election, the stated purpose of at least one party is to maintain that gridlock. So how does that fit into your idea that presidential systems don't matter when Republicans are very adamant about not working with the president in power?
Okay, thank you. You guys will leave here thinking that I'm like this guy who thinks everything is great, but I don't. But what I suggest, my answer to this is the following. Let's take a critical look at what gridlock means, right? Gridlock means that, I mean, the two actors who are in gridlock, the Congress and the president, or the executive, they know exactly what they need to do in order to cooperate and find a solution that is acceptable to both. But as part of that negotiation, they also have an interest in propagating or telling the whole world that they have the right position, but the other side is the one preventing a solution from being found. My point is this, it is possible, there are different ways to analyze this, but this is what I know about the US and what I know about some other countries in Latin America. There are no difference in the number or in the proportion of important bills that are approved by, let's say, divided governments in the US and unified governments. So when important legislation, when parties want to pass important legislation, they pass this legislation. In Brazil, during the 1990s, when there was hyperinflation, I mean, crazy inflation, everybody, the president, would constantly complain to the press, to whoever wanted to hear, that he knew exactly what needed to be done, but Congress did not allow him to do it. But a study of the systematic observation of the data of how many bills the president sent to Congress, which they can do in Brazil, although not here, how many of those bills were approved by Congress, how many, what people discovered is that the numbers were staggering. In the midst of that incredible gridlock, they changed the Constitution that had been adopted in 1988 several times, and they changed a lot of very, very important policies, going from federalism to health care, to social security. So very fundamental policies. So we have to take a step back when you hear gridlock and ask, who has an interest, a political interest in saying that we are in a gridlock? Now, I'm not saying that the gridlock is not there. People can get into gridlock because they make mistakes about what they expect the other party to do. But the point is that when there is a gridlock, that means what is the policy that wins? Is the status quo, right? Is the policy that is in place right now. A bill in Congress changes the status quo to some new status quo. Now, if there is a gridlock, it must be because somebody of this, one of these parties, prefers the status quo to any of the changes that have been proposed. So it's not as if like there is, everybody is unhappy with gridlock, that gridlock is something that, happens to us because, we are this difficult. No, gridlock is part of the political process, and actors use it strategically, and they say different things from what they actually mean. This? Mm-hmm.
Hi. Out of all of the presidential systems that are experiencing backsliding around the world, to my knowledge, the U.S. is the only one that still has an electoral college, and a lot of the previous speakers have talked about how that is a large contributor to the U.S.'s democratic backsliding.
Which, I'm sorry, I lost the, could you start again? I'm sorry.
Yeah, you're good.
Yeah.
To my knowledge,
Yeah.
all of the presidential democratic systems experiencing backsliding around the world do not have an electoral college except for the U.S.
Yes.
So I was just wondering if you think that that's a major contributor to the U.S.'s democratic backsliding, or if we would still be experiencing democratic backsliding even if we didn't have an electoral college.
I think the electoral college is the major reason why Trump was elected. I mean, that is not under doubt. I mean, like it's clear, right? I mean, like in the first election, he didn't win a majority of the popular vote. The US is the only country in the world, the only democracy, as a matter of fact, the only presidential system, democratic or not, that uses a system of electoral colleges like that. There are some parliamentary democracies, like in India, in which the president is elected through some kind of electoral college, but it's a huge college with like 20,000 people. It's almost like an election, a popular election. So it is not a good system. But it is the system that is in place. I think the dilemma, and that's what I'm saying, I mean, like I think there are many people who agree, even if they don't disagree with the idea of the electoral college, they don't agree that it is a system that should stay in place because of the, it was devised 200 plus years ago, and we live in a different reality today. So I think it is a contributor to all of that, just like some other aspects of the Constitution. But what used to be so good about the US Constitution that was so hard to be changed by temporary majorities now became a hindrance. And it's so hard to be changed by temporary majorities because there is clearly a majority in favor of implementing some fundamental changes to the Constitution, but it is so impossible in the current political climate that nobody even tries, right? And this way we keep having, it does exert pressure on the political system, in my opinion, but we don't know what's going to happen. So, thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Special thanks to Dr. Cheibub for joining us. Just as a reminder, if you're interested in attending the Kinzinger event next week, please sign up. I don't have the QR code right now, but you can find the link on the Honors website. And we look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks.